3 elite agricultural engineering firms swore the East Basin tract was a total loss, draining a family farm toward bankruptcy. They dismissed the farmer's daughter as just another girl playing in the dirt. They were wrong. This is the story of how one woman outsmarted the million-dollar corporate experts. Dust choked the sweltering August air over Otoe County, Nebraska, settling like a death shroud over the dying corn stalks of the East Basin. For 3 generations, the Jenkins family had pulled life from this soil, but this newly acquired 500-acre parcel was bleeding them dry. William Jenkins, a man whose hands were mapped with the scars of 40 years of manual labor, stood at the edge of the field. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of impending ruin. He had gambled the farm's entire equity to buy this land from the Hastings estate, relying on a state-of-the-art, Reinke computerized pivot irrigation system to turn the historically stubborn dirt into high-yield acreage. Instead, the system was failing. Half the field was drowning in a toxic alkaline marsh, while the other half was baking into cracked, impenetrable ceramic. Standing a few paces behind William was his daughter Hannah. At 24, she possessed her father's stubborn jawline and a freshly minted agricultural engineering degree from Iowa State University. She had spent the last 3 weeks out in the blistering heat with a soil auger and a multimeter pulling core samples and testing the resistance on the pivot's moisture sensors. She knew exactly what was happening beneath the surface, but in the patriarchal world of Midwestern agribusiness, a daughter with a diploma was still just a girl who ought to be helping her mother with the farm accounts. William had refused to listen to her theories. Driven by panic and a looming loan payment to Omaha Central Bank, he had spent $30,000 to hire Prairie Ag, consulting the most prestigious agronomy firm in the tri-state area. A silver Ford F-150, washed so recently it gleamed unnaturally against the gravel driveway pulled up to the barn. Out stepped Derek Lawson. He was the lead engineer for Prairie Ag, a man who looked more suited for a Wall Street boardroom than a Nebraska cornfield. He wore pressed khaki trousers and leather work boots that had clearly never stepped in mud. Lawson carried a customized iPad Pro and a condescending smile. "Mr. Jenkins," Lawson said, extending a soft hand, "let's get this sorted out. I've been looking at your satellite telemetry data on the drive over. I think we've already pinpointed the bottleneck." Hannah stepped forward, wiping grease from her hands onto her denim overalls. "Mr. Lawson, I'm Hannah. I've been pulling deep core samples all week. The telemetry is misleading. If you look at the lower topography on the south quadrant, the pressure transducers on the Reinke system are miscalibrated. They're reading the perched water table as soil saturation, which is causing the variable rate nozzles to shut off on the high ground and flood the low ground." Lawson paused, his smile freezing into a patronizing smirk. He looked past her, directing his gaze entirely at William. "William, is this your daughter? It's always nice to see the younger generation taking an interest. But satellite NDVI imagery doesn't lie, sweetheart. The issue isn't the transducers. It's a simple case of hydraulic pressure drop. Your main deep well turbine is underpowered for the elevation gradient. It's a classic flow rate stall. It's not the pump," Hannah insisted, her voice tightening. "A larger pump will just push more volume into the manifold and blow the check valves. The soil percolation rate in the East Basin can't handle that kind of flow. I have the infiltration data right here." She reached for a binder resting on the tailgate of their rusted Chevy. William put a heavy calloused hand on her arm, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Hannah, that's enough. Mr. Lawson drove 3 hours from Lincoln. He's the expert. Let the man work." The betrayal stung worse than the blistering wind. Hannah clamped her jaw shut, clutching the binder to her chest. She watched in silent fury as Lawson spent the next hour walking the perimeter, pointing his iPad at the massive steel spans of the pivot system completely ignoring the soil beneath his feet. By the end of the day, Lawson had drafted a binding recommendation. Jenkins Farms needed to rip out their perfectly functional 50-horsepower pump and replace it with a massive industrial-grade 100-horsepower variable frequency drive. The cost, including installation, by Lawson's preferred contractors, was a staggering $150,000. William, desperate for a silver bullet, signed the authorization. He pulled the funds from their emergency operating line of credit, maxing out the farm's financial safety net. For a week, construction crews tore up the earth, installing the massive new turbine. Lawson stood by, taking photos for his firm's promotional materials. When the installation was complete, Lawson confidently hit the ignition switch. The massive diesel generator roared to life. Water surged through the pipes with incredible force. For 2 glorious days, the pivot moved flawlessly, spraying a massive even mist over the dying corn. William hugged Lawson, tears in his eyes, thanking him for saving the farm. On the morning of the 3rd day, Hannah was awakened by a deafening metallic shriek echoing across the plains. She threw on her boots and sprinted to the pump house. Thick black smoke was pouring from the generator. The main manifold pipe had ruptured under the immense unregulated pressure, violently spraying thousands of gallons of water directly into the electrical housing. Worse, just as Hannah had predicted, the massive pump had sucked the localized aquifer pocket dry. The pump had cavitated, spinning dry, until the bearings melted into a chunk of fused, worthless slag. Lawson's miracle fix was destroyed. The East Basin was completely without water, and Jenkins Farms was now officially $180,000 in debt with nothing to show for it but a smoldering piece of scrap metal and a flooded pump house. The silence at the Jenkins dinner table was suffocating. 3 weeks had passed since the pump disaster. Derek Lawson and Prairie Ag Consulting had hidden behind a wall of corporate liability clauses, refusing to refund a single dime, claiming the failure was an unforeseen geological anomaly. Omaha Central Bank had sent a certified letter giving William 90 days to cure his defaulted loan or face foreclosure. William had aged 10 years in a month. His eyes were hollow, his hands trembling as he stared at his coffee. Yet pride is a venomous thing. Instead of turning to his daughter, whose data binder sat ignored on the kitchen counter, he doubled down. He mortgaged his childhood home, the original farmhouse that had been paid off for 2 decades, to hire an elite hydrology firm out of Chicago. Apex Soil and Water was famous for turning barren wastelands into corporate mega-farms. Their lead field director, Bradley Hayes, arrived with a team of 3 technicians and a convoy of heavy equipment. Hayes was a towering, aggressive man with a booming voice and a total lack of patience. He didn't just ignore Hannah, he actively belittled her. "We don't need your college notes, little lady," Hayes barked on his first morning, waving away her soil analysis. "We use ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic induction. We see the Earth in 3D. We don't guess." Hayes and his team spent 4 days driving a specialized buggy across the East Basin, beaming radar waves deep into the subsoil. They set up a command center in Williams' barn, displaying colorful heat maps on massive flat-screen monitors. "Here's your killer, Bill," Hayes announced, pointing a laser pointer at a solid red band stretching across the digital map. "You've got a massive continuous subsurface clay pan exactly 4 feet down. It's creating an impermeable bathtub effect. The water hits the clay pools up and drowns the roots, dragging alkaline salts to the surface. Lawson was an idiot to think a bigger pump would fix this. You need deep ripping and extensive pattern tiling." Hayes's proposal was brutal. He wanted to bring in massive bulldozers with 6-foot steel ripper shanks to physically shatter the subterranean clay pan. Then they would use trenchers to install perforated drainage tiles every 50 feet across the entire 500-acre parcel. It was a violent, invasive surgery for the land. the price tag $250,000. That night, unable to sleep, Hannah crept down to the barn. The Apex team had left their command center running. She slipped a flash drive into their main terminal and copied the raw, unrendered radar data. Back in her bedroom, lit only by the glow of her laptop, Hannah ran the data through her own modeling software. Something didn't make sense. Clay pans were typically uniform, but the radar returns showed jagged, irregular spikes of extreme density. It didn't look like compressed dirt. It looked like rock. Hannah pulled out a dusty, leather-bound box from her closet. It contained her great-grandfather's original surveyor journals from the late 1890s, alongside old geological survey maps she had copied from the county archives. She spent hours meticulously overlaying the historical maps with Hayes's modern radar data. At 4 a.m., the horrific truth clicked into place. It wasn't a clay pan. It was an ancient buried limestone ridge, a subterranean cliff face that had been completely covered by centuries of topsoil erosion. If Hayes brought in deep rippers and shattered that limestone, he wouldn't drain the field. He would destroy the structural integrity of the bedrock. He would create a massive, unstable karst landscape, essentially turning the East Basin into a giant sinkhole waiting to collapse. At dawn, Hannah marched out to the command center. Hayes was sipping coffee from a Yeti thermos, laughing with his technicians. William was standing nearby, looking exhausted, but hopeful. "You can't rip this field," Hannah said, slapping her laptop down on the folding table. "Bradley, your software is misinterpreting the density feedback. It's limestone, not clay. Look at this historical overlay. If you drag 6-foot steel shanks through that rock shelf, you'll fracture the bedrock. You'll ruin the land permanently." Hayes stopped laughing. He looked at Hannah, his face reddening with anger. "Are you out of your mind? You're bringing me a hand-drawn map from a dead guy to argue with a $50,000 ground radar unit. The radar just shows density," Hannah yelled, losing her temper. "It doesn't identify the material. If you shatter that limestone, the first heavy rain we get will wash the topsoil straight down into the fractures. The ground will literally fall out from under the tractors. William?" Hayes snapped, turning to her father. "I am not going to be lectured by a girl who thinks she's an agronomist because she read a textbook. You control her, or my team packs up right now, and you can keep your swamp." William looked at Hannah, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading anger. "Hannah, go back to the house. Now, you are done interfering." "Dad, please, they are going to destroy the farm." "I said go," William roared, his voice echoing off the barn walls. Tears of frustration hot on her cheeks, Hannah grabbed her laptop and ran. The Apex team brought in the heavy machinery the next day. The earth shook violently as the massive caterpillar tractors dragged the steel ripper shanks through the soil. The horrifying sound of screeching metal grinding against unseen rock echoed for miles. But Hayes insisted it was just heavily compacted hardpan. They spent a week shattering the subterranean shelf and laying miles of black plastic drainage pipe. When they finished, Hayes collected his massive check and drove back to Chicago, promising William a bumper crop the following season. 2 weeks later, the Nebraska sky turned bruised purple. A massive late-summer supercell stalled over Otto County, dumping 5 inches of rain in less than 4 hours. Hannah stood on the porch watching the nightmare unfold exactly as she had predicted. The shattered limestone bedrock acted like an open drain in a bathtub. The heavy rain didn't absorb into the soil. It violently rushed downward, pulling the loose, newly ripped topsoil with it. Entire sections of the East Basin simply caved in. Massive, jagged sinkholes, some 20 feet wide and 6 feet deep, opened up across the landscape. The newly installed plastic drainage tiles were ripped apart by the shifting earth, violently erupting from the ground like severed black arteries. By morning, the storm had passed. The East Basin was destroyed. It looked like a bombed-out war zone, completely impassable by any farm equipment. William Jenkins walked out into the devastation, fell to his knees in the mud and wept. The farm was dead. The experts had killed it, and the bank was coming. Omaha Central Bank did not care about broken hearts or shattered limestone. They only cared about the bottom line. Less than 48 hours after the catastrophic rainstorm destroyed the East Basin, a black Lincoln Navigator crawled up the Jenkins gravel driveway. Out stepped Richard Caldwell, Vice President of Commercial Agricultural Lending, accompanied by the bank's own contracted liquidation specialist. William Jenkins sat on the porch steps, staring blankly at the mud on his boots. He didn't even stand up when Caldwell approached. The bank had officially invoked the acceleration clause on the farm's mortgage. "William, I take no pleasure in this," Caldwell said, his tone dripping with practiced corporate sympathy. "But the asset has been severely degraded. Apex Soil and Water filed a report claiming the sinkholes were a pre-existing geological hazard that you failed to disclose. We are scheduling a public foreclosure auction for the end of the month." Caldwell gestured to the man standing beside him. "This is Dr. Leon Ashford from Meridian Biochemical. He's here to perform an emergency stabilization on the parcel. We have to make the land presentable for prospective corporate buyers, or it won't even cover a fraction of your debt." Dr. Ashford was a man who wore his Cornell Ph.D. like a weapon. He didn't bother looking at William. Instead, he surveyed the ruined, cratered expanse of the East Basin through expensive, polarized sunglasses. "It's an absolute mess," Ashford muttered furiously, typing on his tablet. "The structural integrity of the topsoil is gone, and the alkaline salts from the lower water table have been pulled to the surface by the erosion. My team will deploy a heavy aerial application of anionic polyacrylamide PAM mixed with high-concentration liquid gypsum. The polymers will instantly bind the loose soil to stop the sinkholes from expanding, and the gypsum will flush the sodium out of the root zone. We'll bake it into a stable crust. It's a standard chemical remediation." Hannah, who had been listening from the screen door, pushed her way onto the porch. Her hands were balled into fists. She had spent the last 2 days meticulously analyzing the chemical makeup of the mud from the sinkholes. "You can't use liquid gypsum out there," Hannah warned, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Dr. Ashford, the localized groundwater here doesn't just have high sodium. It has exceptionally high levels of magnesium and carbonates. If you dump calcium sulfate gypsum on top of that specific mineral profile and then bind it with PAM polymers, you aren't going to flush the soil. You're going to trigger a rapid precipitation reaction. The sun will bake it, and you will literally create a layer of impermeable calcium carbonate concrete across 500 acres." Ashford finally looked at her, pulling his sunglasses down the bridge of his nose. He offered a tight, patronizing smile. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, young lady. Did you learn about cation exchange in a community college chemistry class? This is industrial agronomy. We use proprietary chemical modeling. The PAM prevents precipitation. Now please let the adults handle the salvage operation." "My degree is from Iowa State, and my data is from the actual dirt you're standing on, not a corporate lab simulation," Hannah fired back, stepping off the porch. "Look at the USDA NRCS soil surveys for this specific Hold Reg Silt loam. The buffering capacity is completely compromised. If you spray that chemical cocktail, nothing will ever grow in that field again. You will turn it into a parking lot." "Miss Jenkins, that is quite enough," Caldwell interrupted, his voice turning cold. "Your father's mismanagement has already cost this bank hundreds of thousands of dollars. We are not taking agricultural advice from a young woman who has never run a commercial operation. Dr. Ashford has full authorization." William finally looked up, his eyes dead defeated. "Let it go, Hannah," he whispered hoarsely. "It's over. It's not our land anymore. The next morning, Meridian Biochemical's massive spray rigs rolled onto the property. They looked like mechanical locusts, their huge booms extending 90 feet across. For 12 hours, they coated the ruined East Basin in thousands of gallons of a thick, milky chemical slurry. Ashford stood by his truck, confidently ensuring the application was perfectly uniform over the sinkholes and the remaining alkaline mud. Then, the brutal Nebraska sun came out. For 3 straight days, temperatures soared above 95 degrees. Just as Hannah's calculations had predicted, the chemical reaction was violently unforgiving. The calcium from the gypsum bonded with the native carbonates in the soil, locked in place by the synthetic polymers. By the end of the week, the entire East Basin had cured. The ground turned a sickly, pale white. Caldwell returned with an auctioneer to walk the property. They couldn't even drive a steel stake into the ground to hang the foreclosure sale sign. The topsoil had literally calcified. It was as hard as highway pavement. The bank's expert chemical stabilization hadn't just failed, it had sterilized the land. Dr. Ashford refused to return Caldwell's furious phone calls. The appraisal firm downgraded the land's value to pennies on the dollar. The farm wasn't even worth enough to cover the remaining loans. The bank was going to seize the main farmhouse, William's childhood home, to cover the difference. William sat at the kitchen table, staring at the foreclosure notice. The auction was set for exactly 14 days from now. He looked older than time itself, a man completely broken by his trust in arrogant men in clean boots. Hannah walked into the kitchen and slammed a pair of heavy leather work gloves down on the foreclosure papers. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying a steel that made William look up. 3 teams of experts have come out here. They ignored the telemetry. They ignored the geology. And they ignored the chemistry. They nearly destroyed our family because they couldn't stand the idea that a 24-year-old girl might know the dirt better than their million-dollar algorithms. She leaned over the table, locking eyes with her father. "The bank takes the house in 14 days. We have nothing left to lose. Give me the keys to the shop. Let me do my job." William stared at the gloves, then up at his daughter. For the first time in months, he truly saw her. He didn't see a girl. He saw an engineer. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the heavy brass keys to the equipment shed, and slid them across the table. Dawn had not yet broken when Hannah fired up the farm's rusted backhoe. She didn't have $250,000. She had $800 left in her personal savings account, a toolkit, and an intimate understanding of the East Basin's wounds. Her first target was the massive ruined water system. Lawson's 100-horsepower pump was a melted heap of slag, but the original 50-horsepower turbine was still sitting in the shed. Hannah didn't hire a crew. She and William wrestled the old pump onto the bed of their Chevy, drove it to the wellhead, and spent 14 grueling hours bolting it back onto the manifold. But Hannah knew the old pump couldn't push water up the elevation gradient without stalling. That was the original problem. Instead of forcing it, she used basic physics. She drove to a local irrigation supply store and bought high-grade PVC bypass valves. She repiped the main line, splitting the pressure into 2 separate lower-volume zones. Next, she tackled the Rankine pivot system. She climbed the massive steel trusses with a soldering iron, and an Arduino microcontroller she had programmed herself in her bedroom. The original corporate pressure transducers had been reading the perched water table as saturation. Hannah completely bypassed them. She hardwired cheap, effective soil resistance sensors directly into the pivot's variable rate nozzles, syncing them to a localized closed-loop network. The pivot would now only drop water exactly where the soil was genuinely dry, ignoring the misleading satellite telemetry altogether. But the biggest hurdle was the soil itself. Ashford's chemical concrete had sealed the earth, and Hayes's sinkholes were treacherous traps. You cannot fight nature with brute force. You have to use nature to break nature. Hannah drove to the local seed cooperative and spent her last $300 on a highly specific, custom cover crop blend. Daikon tillage radishes, deep-rooting alfalfa, and yellow sweet clover. Daikon radishes don't grow wide. They grow deep, driving massive taproots through incredibly compacted soil with thousands of pounds of biological pressure per square inch. It was a technique known as bio-drilling. Hannah loaded the seed into a broadcast spreader. She couldn't use a tractor on the calcified, cratered field, so she walked it. For 3 agonizing days, under the blistering late summer sun, Hannah walked all 500 acres, manually broadcasting the seed into the tiny microfissures of Ashford's chemical crust, specifically targeting the collapsed cast sinkholes. Once the seed was down, she fired up her modified Reinke pivot. The old 50-horsepower pump hummed to life perfectly. The bypass valves managed the pressure flawlessly. As the massive pivot slowly crawled across the field, Hannah's custom-coded Arduino controller worked a miracle. The variable rate nozzles didn't flood the low ground. They pulsed with pinpoint accuracy, delivering a micro-mist just damp enough to trigger germination in the cover crop without causing runoff into the sinkholes. For a week, Hannah and William slept in the barn, monitoring the pressure gauges every 2 hours. On day 8, the concrete crust began to crack. The daikon radishes had germinated. Driven by the targeted micro-irrigation, millions of tiny biological jackhammers drove downward into the chemical hardpan. The crust began to splinter, emitting sharp, popping sounds in the quiet of the morning. By day 10, the radishes had penetrated the calcium carbonate layer, entirely reaching the trapped topsoil beneath. The alfalfa and sweet clover followed their roots, stabilizing the edges of Hayes's sinkholes, binding the loose earth together like natural living rebar. The field was literally breathing again, the alkaline salts actively being absorbed and neutralized by the aggressive cover crops. On the morning of the 14th day, Richard Caldwell arrived at Jenkins Farms, trailed by a convoy of trucks carrying auction buyers and liquidation lawyers. They drove down the gravel path, expecting to bid on a sterilized calcified wasteland. Caldwell stepped out of his navigator and froze. The East Basin was not white pavement. It was a sea of vibrant, explosive green. The massive daikon radish leaves had formed a dense canopy, completely covering the sinkholes. The Reinke pivot was sweeping silently across the horizon, dispensing a perfect misting rain. The soil underneath was dark, rich, and radically fractured, absorbing the water with perfect hydraulic conductivity. Among the prospective buyers was Martin Gable, the owner of the largest independent grain cooperative in the Midwest, a man who built his empire in the dirt, not in a boardroom. He walked past Caldwell, dropped to one knee, and pulled a massive radish from the earth. It came up with a satisfying snap, bringing a chunk of the shattered chemical crust with it. Martin examined the root, then looked at the rusted bypass valves and the jury-rigged Arduino controller mounted on the pivot. He turned to William, who was standing on the porch next to Hannah. "Who engineered this?" Martin demanded, his voice thick with awe. "The telemetry bypass, the biological hardpan fracture. This is brilliant. Prairie Ag couldn't pull this off with $1 million budget." William swallowed hard tears welling in his eyes. He didn't point to a man in a suit. He put his arm around his daughter. "She did," William said, his voice thick with pride. "My daughter. The lead engineer of Jenkins Farms." Martin Gable didn't hesitate. He walked straight up to Caldwell. "Cancel the auction. My cooperative is buying the Jenkins note in full right now, and I'm hiring this young woman on a consulting retainer to retrofit my entire southern acreage." Caldwell stood speechless as the corporate expert's failure was completely dismantled by a 24-year-old girl in grease-stained overalls. Hannah had saved the farm not with millions of dollars or arrogant assumptions, but with actual science, calloused hands, and a refusal to be silenced. True expertise doesn't wear a suit, it wears the dirt of hard-earned knowledge. Hannah's story proves that prejudice and corporate hubris will always lose to genuine skill and relentless determination. Never let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter just because of who you are. If Hannah's fight against the corporate giants inspired, you please hit that like button, share this unbelievable true story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life tales of underdogs who change the world.